to introduce Barret Blake, and we are so excited to have him speak to us tonight about Spec-Kit. So,
okay, I think I'm all set. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about specification-driven development this evening, and specifically with GitHub's implementation of it, which is called Spec-Kit. So let's cover just real quickly what the agenda for this is. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the general problem is with AI development, and a little bit about specification-driven development or spec-driven development. Then we'll get into Spec-Kit specifically, and GitHub's solution to approaching spec-driven development, and just do a couple of demos and talk about some best practices there at the end. So we're going to talk about the problem first. So generally, it's very popular these days to talk about vibe coding. It's one of these concepts where anybody can create this amazing application just by chatting with GPT or whatever, ChatGPT or whatever it might be, Claude, and they think that some spectacular enterprise-grade application is going to come out of that, and it just doesn't work that way. Too often you give vague prompts to the AI and just kind of accept whatever comes out of it, and it's fine for simple things, proof of concepts, little tiny applications that don't do very much. But it isn't going to get you a commercial or enterprise grade application of any sort by taking that kind of approach. And the problem with that isn't, like it says here, this quote from Dan Delmarsky, that the problem isn't the ability of the coding agent, it's our approach to it. We treat it like a search engine when we should be treating them more like pair programmers, and especially should be treating them like entry level. Basically entry-level pair programmers, junior developers, if you will. And it's because the prompts that we're giving AI when we're doing this vibe coding, so to speak, is that these prompts are too vague, they're too simple, they don't provide context, they don't provide the detailed specifications, and as a result, what we get out of AI is also vague and unguided and not detailed, and it doesn't solve the problem that we're trying to solve with these kind of approaches. So along comes specification-driven development, and this isn't a new concept, but the approach that we'll be talking about here in a little bit is kind of new. But to talk a little bit about what spec-driven development is in general, if we go back to the very early days of software development, you would have these waterfall development approaches where you would spend weeks or months, sometimes even years, gathering all the requirements, talking to all the business people, trying to figure out what the problem is, and then creating these huge documents that cover every aspect of what we want to do in this application, and then those documents get thrown into SharePoint or Jira or whatever it might be, and then they get ignored and forgotten. Spec-driven development kind of takes the good parts of that, and that you're creating these detailed documents and combining it with the best parts of agile development approaches, and that the documentations are living, they're not forgotten, they're not shoved off someplace, they live with the code. In most cases, you'll keep the documents right there in the same repo that your code is in. They are considered living documents, in that you should constantly be modifying them, updating them, reviewing them, and they should be small and iterative in their approach, in that you do little bits at a time. You don't create these massive documents and then shove them off somewhere and forget about them. Instead, you create the documentation that you need for a particular feature, and you take that approach and you just work with that, and you keep iterating through that. And that's generally the concept of spec-driven development. And what GitHub's done is they have created this system that kind of pairs all the best parts of spec-driven development with your favorite AI agent. And it's something that's fairly new. It's only been around, it was released last September, so it's less than a year old. It's not even 10 months old yet. And it's something that was designed from the ground up to be able to take this spec-driven development approach and pair that with whatever AI that you're using. And that's one of the great things about it is it's agent agnostic. To work with Claude or Cursor or ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever it is that you want to do. And you can take that agent that you're working with and use it to create these detailed and complex documentation pieces and documents that will be the guiding factors that will enable the AI coding agent part of it to create software that's actually useful and usable, and something that, for the most part, you can make a part of your enterprise grade applications. And there are a few key components to it. The basis of it is a CLI tool called Specify, and it's written in Python. It runs on either Bash or PowerShell from your command prompt. And you can either run it ad hoc as needed using UVX, which is the Python, basically the Python version of NuGet, because it's their approach to Python's libraries. Or you can install it locally and upgrade it and run it from your command line, whenever you need it. And what it will do is it will install in a project folder a series of subfolders, and in those subfolders it will put some templates and script files that will allow you to interact with your AI coding agent in a way that will allow you to use a spec-driven development approach to your software development. And there's really, not much in the way of prerequisites. You have to have your development environment. You have to have selected an AI coding agent. You do have to install Python in order to run UVX to install the CLI. But once it's installed, you don't need that anymore. And so it is kind of annoying that, if you don't want to install Python, you do have to have it for that one little bit at the very beginning. But once you have that, you don't need it anymore. It's entirely self-sufficient. And what you'll do is you'll initialize a project using that command, the specify command, and it'll walk you through a short, and I'll do a demo here in a little bit, but it'll walk you through a short wizard that will help you to set up the project. And then once that project is set up, then you use your coding tool to run various prompts to help you with that development process. And the workflow itself has a few steps to it. There's an initial step, which is the constitution. And basically what that does will create a constitution markdown file, and that is the overall guiding file that kind of controls everything else that's going on. And I'll talk about each of these in detail in a minute. But that's the first step. You'll do that once at the very beginning, and then you won't ever need to do that again. You can make adjustments to it. Like I say, these documents should all be considered living, breathing documents, and you should be able to update them whenever you need to. Once you get past that first step, though, then you do through the iterative process, steps 2 through 6 there. And what it will do is, for each of those, you'll start with your MVP, your absolute minimum, and then that's with the specify command. And then with each iteration, it'll create these specifications, which should kind of correlate to each user story or each feature that you're going to be working on. After you work through the specification, then you'll do the technical part, which is the plan command. After that, you'll do the task command, which will take that information that's been generated from the spec and the technical plan and create a functional task list. And then you go through the implement steps, and you can either have your AI agent do the coding, you can do the coding yourself, or whatever combination, however you want to break down those tasks into assignments. And that's the implement phase. And then, of course, with each iteration, you do your pull request, your code review, and publish it and merge it into your main branch. So that's kind of the high-level overview. And I just want to go through each of these in detail a little bit. So you'll start with, as I mentioned, with your constitution file. And these are the foundational principles that your AI will be guided by throughout the rest of it. This is where you would define like your coding standards, your approaches. It's the equivalent of like the Claude Markdown file or your agent's Markdown file. These files that you create that are included with every single pass in the context that help control and limit and guide what the AI coding agent can and should not do. And just in Spec-Kit, it's called the constitution file, but it does the same job as those. The next part is you start getting through the iterative steps. You start with your user, your features, your user stories, And for each of those, you will do the specify command. And what that does is it is where you will define basically the user story for that step. What it is that you want to do. You work small, just like you would if you were specifying out all the user stories in Jira or DevOps or whatever it is that you're working with. And you will target what the users are, the use cases. Like I say, the first iteration, you always want to start with the MVP, maybe just the project structure itself. And then you just keep iterating through it as you go. The technical plan is where you would define all of your architectural decisions, your technical details, what the implementation approach is. If you want to provide guidance on the data models, how the schema should be set up, what your testing strategy is. And even though this is an iterative process, you only need to define it once for each iteration. So, for instance, for your MVP, for your first pass, you would do things like, here's what my tech stack is going to be. Is it going to be .NET 10? Is it going to be Aspire? Is it going to be an Angular on the front end for my user interface, or am I going to use Postgres or SQL Server? Those kinds of details you'll define in that first pass. And then as you go through each iteration in the future, you don't have to redefine those. You would just include in each iteration the technical details that are related to that specific thing. So maybe on your fifth iteration, you're going to add, blob storage for files. So for the plan, the technical plan for that iteration, you would define out, here's my blob storage, here's where it's going to be, is the account that it's going to be under. This is what we're going to name it. This is how we're going to approach saving files, retrieving files, naming files, that kind of stuff. It would be all the stuff that you would define, and that you wouldn't have to redefine all the stuff that you've done before, because it can look at the application, it can see the existing setup and work from that. So you just have to add the additional details that are relevant to that iteration. And then once you've got the technical plan done and the specification done, the next part is the tasks, and it will take all those, it will convert them into actionable steps, and it'll say, okay, in order to do this, I need to do these 10 steps. In order to do the next user's part of the story, I need, these 22 steps or whatever it might be. And it creates this prioritized task list, and it will do it in order. It'll break it down into phases, and I'll show examples again here in a little bit, but it breaks it down into phases. It'll define, what the checkpoints are at the end of each phase. In order for, these first 10 steps to be passed off and accepted, I have to be able to, run .NET Build, all the unit tests pass, and this and this and this. Whatever it do, it'll generate these checkpoint ideas or statements, and say, in order to move on to the next phase, I have to be able to sign off on the first phase or the previous phase. And this helps you to break down how you're going to assign out the tasks and to figure out, like it says there, estimate the complexity of it. And it's also a good way of, it does a good job of identifying dependencies. So, if tasks, 1 through 5 have to be done before task 6 can be started, it'll define all that in the file. And it generates all these files as markdown files, I should point out as well. And then, once you've got your tasks broken down and laid out and accepted, and one other thing I should mention is that at each phase, it's important that you're reviewing these documents that are getting generated. There may be details that you need to add to it. There may be things you need to clarify. So it's not something you just hand it off to the AI and let the AI start beginning to end. There's always these checkpoints and checks and balances where you as the human need to review what it is that the AI has generated and to sign off on that and accept that before you move on to the next phase. And then once you get to the code writing part, all of your tasks are broken down and accepted, and you think everything's good there. Then you go through the implementation phase, and you can do, like I say, any combination of, the AI writing the code, the user, or, the developers writing the code. And then in combination of that, you can tell the AI to say, okay, just go ahead and do all the tasks yourself. Or you can say, do tasks 1 through 10, and then you can parse out, the other tasks to other developers, whatever it might be. And you can break it down in any way that you want. And there is another command that I'll show you in a second where you can take this task list that's been generated, and you can turn those into GitHub issues and tasks on GitHub in your repo, so that you can, assign those out however you want to that way as well. And then, of course, at the end of each phase, you're doing your code reviews, you're doing your sign-offs, and approvals, and whatever your normal workflow is there. It doesn't change with specification development or with spec-driven development. Some of the other commands that are kind of available out of the box, is the check. It's just kind of a self-check to see if all the tools are working correctly. With the specification command or the specify command, you only run that once per iteration. Because what that does as part of that setup is it will create a branch. It will create a folder structure in your application that's tied to that branch and to that user story. And maybe you get that created, you'll get in there and you'll realize, okay, I forgot this and I forgot that and I forgot this. So if you need to add additional details, if you need to change things, if you decide, okay, I'm not going to do these 2 tasks that I thought I was going to include as part of this, I want to move those to the next one, then at that point you would use the clarify command, and that tells it to take what was written in the specification and either change details, add details, add some more description to it, whatever it might be. You would use the clarify command to do that. So it tells it, okay, I'm making modifications to my existing specification. It's not time to move on to a new modification. One of the other things it'll do is it's creating these documents and working through all these processes. It may create checklists of various kinds, and I'll show you a couple examples of those as I get into the demo part. And before it can go through the implementation phase, it has to go through all these checklists and sign off that the checklists are completed. It may be like a requirements checklist. It may be a research checklist. There's all kinds of different checklists that it might generate or that you might generate yourself as well. But in order for it to, in order for you to turn over the implementation task to the AI to start the coding, all the checklists have to be signed off and accepted. And so if you want to check the status checklist, then you'd run that checklist command. It'll go out there and look at it and say, okay, all these checklists are complete. I'm ready to go. Or it might say, okay, this checklist has 5 items that still need to be checked off. Here's what we need to do to address those items, whatever it might be. The next command is the analyze command. Now, we all know that AI doesn't always behave. Sometimes it goes off the rails. Sometimes it goes way off the rails. So what it will do is it's generating all these various documents as part of the process. If you feel like maybe there's some inconsistencies there, or if you just want to check it, you can run the analyze command. What it will do is it will review all the documents that are related to the current iteration that you're working through, the current specification. And it will kind of compare and contrast those, and it'll look at those and say, okay, all these various pieces, there are some inconsistencies here, things that we need to address, things that we need to fix. And sometimes it might need to fix them, or it can fix them itself. Sometimes it might need you to clarify things, whatever it might be. But it's a good way of kind of doing a self-check to make sure that everything is ready to go before you move on to the implement phase. And then I mentioned the task to issues. That's the command that you would, where it would take those task lists that are generated and turn those into GitHub issues. And that way, you can parse them out if you want to assign someone to other people. In the last couple of months, they've added a couple more features to Spec-Kit. One of them is the extensions. So this has provided the ability for the community to create these specifications that are community written and created and can add a bunch more additional features to Spec-Kit. For instance, things like Jira integration, DevOps integration, various code cleanup things. There are, I think it's like 35 extensions that have been created by the community, and almost all of them in the last 2 months. So it's something that's growing fast and is very well supported, and it's been growing quite quickly. And there are you can see the commands there if you want to do a search. There's also a website that they have. It's this one here. It's the Spec-Kit community, spec-kit-community.github.io. And that has a list of all the extensions that have been created up to this point and gives you the opportunity or instructions on how to use each of those and install those. Another feature that they've added is presets. So maybe Spec-Kit, you need to have it has this certain workflow that's put in place in a certain way that it approaches things. If you need to customize that somewhat, you can either make use of presets that other people have created. And again, those are out there in the community, or you can create your own presets. And basically what that does is just, modifying a little bit the way that Spec-Kit works to be more more appropriate to the project that you're working on. So you might have one project, for instance, the examples there, it mentions one on security governance, one where it's adding specific checks and balances to your coding agents to be focused more on security or things like that. So, excuse me. So the presets are another feature that's come along in the last couple of months that's been added to it. As I mentioned, there's a pretty good community ecosystem that's out there, and it's growing quite quickly. And there's a lot of these extensions and presets that are out there and available for people to use. And of course, you can create your own. That's one of the things about Spec-Kit is it is entirely open source. It is entirely, the GitHub team is doing a lot with it, but it's also very community driven as well. There's a lot of community involvement in Spec-Kit, and it's one of the advantages of it over some of the other approaches that are out there. I mentioned, agent support and compatibility. This list has grown quite rapidly as well. Since I first did this talk, I think 3 months ago now was the first time I did it, and at the time there was maybe 5 agents that were supported. Now it's well over 30 now, and this list, like I say, is about a month and a half old, so it's probably quite out of date again as well. But there is a great deal of support out there for whatever agents you want to use, whatever environment you want to use, whether you want to use Claude or whatever it might be. So I see a question there. Can Spec-Kit use MCP for extensions? There are extensions that it can use MCP in the same way that any of the coding agent does. So Spec-Kit itself is not a coding agent. It's a set of scripts to guide what your coding agent does. So it's something that, if the coding agent that you choose to use has that support for MCP servers, then yeah, you can do it that way, and you can adjust the scripts in order to help provide that, and you would do that in the constitution file. You can provide information about which MCP servers to give access to, the same as you would if you were adding those details to like your Claude markdown file or your agents.md file, whatever it might be. It works pretty much the same way. So I hope that answers that question there. All right. So let's get into some demos here. So what I want to start with is just a quick view from the command line. There we go. So I've got this folder here, and as you can see, it's a completely empty folder. So what I want to do is create a specify or run specify to create my project. So you start with the init command. If I wanted to create it in a subfolder, then I would give it a project name like my project or something like that. But in this particular case, because I'm already in the folder where I want the project created, I'll just put in the dot and hit that. And what you'll see here is it runs this command line tool, and it'll walk you through a quick wizard here. So I'm just going to kind of leave the defaults here. So I'm going to select Copilot as my agent. And for each of these agents, you have the option of setting up the scripts for Bash or for PowerShell. Now, this is one of the kind of the downsides of Spec-Kit is once you set this up in a particular way, it's really hard to change those scripts for a different coding agent or for a different environment. So it's one of those things where it's not real easy to do it. Say, if you've got one person that's doing, using Claude on Bash on a Mac, the scripts that you install, if you're doing it for Copilot on PowerShell, it doesn't install the other scripts that are needed. So it makes it very difficult unless your entire team is working on the exact same, development stack. That is one of the downsides. It doesn't really work very well for that. You can swap out the scripts manually and do some, reinitialization, but it's not particularly easy for that. So one of the ways that a lot of people are approaching it is they are making all the stuff that Spec-Kit creates part of the git ignore, so it doesn't get included as part of the repo, so that each developer can create their own set of scripts for Spec-Kit, and that it does work that way fairly well. So do that. So it's really just a couple of steps that are involved in that, and it's set up, and then kind of gives you a little bit of guidelines. So it says, hey, you're ready to go. You can either continue to run the commands from the command line here, but I like working in VS Code, so we'll do code. And I'll show you kind of what you get out of the box here. So what it will do is it will create this project here. You'll get a GitHub repo as part of that. And in the GitHub folder, you'll see two subfolders. One is agents and the other one's prompts. And basically, these are the instructions that are part of each of those commands. So the prompts basically just tells it what agent to run for a particular command. So if I was going to run the constitution command, it says, run agent spec-kit.constitution here. I go up and look at that, and this provides, the details of what that agent, it's basically an agents.md file for this particular command, and it provides it specific instructions on what it should be doing as part of that command. And so that's the two sets of subfolders get added here. The other folder it adds is a specify folder. And what you'll see in here is several folders. You can ignore most of them. So if you were to install instruction or extensions, they would get installed in this extensions folder. Same with integrations. I didn't really touch on that. That's something that's kind of not really in place yet, but it's there. The biggest thing here is this memory folder, and this is where the constitution file will get created at. And if you look at it here, you can obviously see it's empty at the moment. It's basically just a blank template, but it kind of gives you an idea of what the structure will be. And then as you want to run each of the commands, yes.
Do you mind just zooming, if you're going to be in code for a little bit, can you just zoom in one level for the folks in the back of the room?
Oh, yeah. For my other examples, I've got it already zoomed in. I forgot to do it for this one. But I'll be jumping out of this one here in a second. Show you those, but basically for each of the commands, you just go over here to the chat window and you run spec-kit.constitution, and I could kick that off and it will start working. It'll take a few minutes, so I'm not going to sit and wait for it. So what I'm going to do is pull up some of the other ones that I've created here. Let me start with this one. So this project is an API project that I created for stuff that I was doing. I was doing some stuff in Power Automate, like automating some of my social media posts and things like that. I wasn't really happy with how Power Automate was doing all that stuff and all the kind of workarounds that I had to go through to make it all work. So what I decided is, I'm going to redo a bunch of this stuff in .NET. I'm going to create this API for my own use, and have have Spec-Kit do it as a test of Spec-Kit, kind of get used to how Spec-Kit works. So the first thing I ran was the specify command. And what it creates here, as you can see, this is the prompt that I added in as part of the specify command. Actually, maybe I should jump to the constitution first so I can show you that one first. That's probably better because that's the first step. So this is the constitution that it created, and it just kind of gives you an example. You can provide as much detail or as little detail as you want. Like I said, it should kind of be structured in the same way that like an agent's markdown file would be, or a Claude markdown file. Kind of your overall guiding guidelines for that. So first section here is my code quality and consistency, and I've defined this as non-negotiable. You have to do this for everything. And it's just kind of defining some of my style and some of the things that have to be run. I've defined that my project is going to use the clean architecture and the Reaper design. I've designed, this project should be test driven as far as QA. So, it should be doing the test first and doing, basically test driven development as part of that. I want to do everything with Aspire. So it's an Aspire project. I want the project, to be secure by design. So it should include things like, OWASP secure coding guidelines should be followed, things like that. And some more information about observability and logging. Should be simple and maintainable as much as possible. I've defined what my technology stack is overall. may or may not define that in as part of the constitution file. It's kind of up to you how you want to structure that. But if you want to provide like really high level details of what your solution should be, you can do that here as well. Just some other things here. And down at the end, you'll see, or you'll create like a governance section, or it'll create that as well. For most of this stuff here, I just ran the Constitution command. You can provide details as part of the prompt for the Constitution command, and it'll make sure that it includes those, but it'll also come up with a bunch of other things that are there. So most of the stuff that was put into this file, I didn't really provide too much guidance in doing that. Basically, the part that I added here was like this technology stack. I added that myself. I added the clean architecture section here. Most of that I added myself. So it does come up with some pretty good basic Constitution files on its own as part of its general guidelines. But there are a lot of times that you'll want to add additional details. So for the first iteration here, so as I mentioned, it'll create the specs folder, and for each specify command that you do, it'll create a folder structure. And normally what it does is it numbers them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then, provides a description as part of that. There was a bug or something at the time, and I didn't notice until I'd gone several iterations. So you can see I've got several here that start 0, 0, 1. And then as it gets down here, you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So there's several here that in my first 5 or 6 iterations, they all got numbered as 1. I don't know why, but I haven't seen that happen in any other projects. It was just this project that it kind of did that. But this was my first iteration here. So I did social post. I said I'm going to create a web API that will have various utilities for me to use. For the minimum viable product, I want it to be able to post to Blue Sky and Mastodon. I want to be able to add images and hashtags to those posts. Control the length of the post. In accordance with the requirements of those two platforms. And all images should include alt text for accessibility. So this was the prompt that I passed into the specify command when I did this initial iteration. And what it generated from this was the rest of the file. So it came up with several user stories. It prioritized those. So, the top user story is the ability to post to both platforms, and it provides, some description about that. It'll provide like, why is this a priority? It'll come up with this testing. How do I independently verify that this user story has been successfully completed? It'll also come up with some acceptance scenarios, and it uses this logic. For those of you who have done BDD development and are familiar with Gherkin and Cucumber, it kind of borrows that syntax from that. So, given that I have this, when this particular thing happens, then the result should be X, Y, Z, whatever. And it'll come up with several of those. And those acceptance scenarios are both for you as the user and also for the AI to be able to understand when it has successfully completed something. So that's one of the reasons that Markdown is the syntax for all these files, is that these files need to be both human readable and AI understandable. The AI needs to be able to understand the documents. And so, this particular syntax in Markdown is what works for that. So it created several user stories, and I won't walk through all those here. After it goes through the user stories, it'll go through a list of edge cases. So as it will kind of review the goal, what the specification is, it'll come up with these edge cases and say, okay, what happens when this happens? What should I do in this particular case? What happens, for instance, what happens when an image upload succeeds on one, but it doesn't on the other? What should be the result of that? And one of the things that I've found, with Spec-Kit and the way that it works with these AI agents and kind of guides them, is it comes up with a lot of these fantastic edge case ideas, things that I, as a developer, probably wouldn't have thought of myself, at least until I'd gotten, halfway through writing the code. And then, these things suddenly start occurring to me like, oh, well, I should have addressed that. Or I should have planned for that. So I'll get that question in a second here. So it's really good at coming up with that stuff. After the edge cases, it'll list out the functional requirements. So it'll take those user stories, convert them into functional requirements that'll guide the rest of the process. It'll identify what some of the key data entities should be as part of that. It'll identify a list of measurable outcomes. So, what is the definition of success? And it will help define that kind of stuff. It'll come up with a list of assumptions as far as clarifying things. And then one of the other things is, as it is working through this process, if it's not sure how to approach something, it'll ask you for clarification. So as it's generating this specification file, one of the things that it might come back to you in the chat window to say, okay, I have this question. Here's, sometimes it'll provide you multiple choice answers, or it might be open-ended as well. It might say, okay, what do I do in this particular case? And it'll provide me with like 3 options and say, you can either select A, B, or C, or you can, do D, none of the above, do a different approach, and you can provide, free-form text response to that as well. And so one of the things that it does is it captures your response to those. So it asked me the question, what is the default behavior if I don't specify any platforms? And my response was default to all the platforms. And so, it documents that stuff as it's going along and clarifying. So there's a question in the chat says, which AI model did I use? I believe at the time I was using Claude Sonnet 4.5 was what I was doing with this. I kind of jump around between models a bunch. I use, since I do a lot of my development with GitHub Copilot, I can swap out models really quickly and use the different model agents through Copilot. So a lot of the times I'm doing whatever is cheapest for me at the moment, just kind of save my tokens. And because a lot of these are just projects for fun, they're not. A lot of the stuff that I've been doing is not for work or for anything like that. So I'll use whatever works and whatever's kind of cheapest as far as token usage. And as we all know, with the current state of AI, that kind of changes almost weekly, unfortunately. So that's the specification file. So the next step would be the plan document, which is the technical plan. And when you run that command, you can provide the details in the prompt as well, or you can just say, just pass in the command and it'll figure it out itself. In this particular case, because I defined the tech stack in the Constitution file, I didn't need to provide any additional details. It was able to figure out what it needed to do as far as the technical context based on what I provided in those files and what was in the case there. There was like one exception, and one of the things that it'll do is it's generating these files. If it's something where it doesn't come back and ask you the question for clarification, it will put little notes into these files with the flag that says needs clarification. And it'll look like, let's see if I can jump over this checklist here. It'll add this flag here, it needs clarification in the file where you need to provide some additional context. So in this particular case, there were a couple of things that were flagged with that initially. One was what was it? Well, I think it's like target platform, because I hadn't defined where this was going to be deployed to. It said, needs clarification. So I put in, Linux Windows Server because it was going to eventually go to Azure App Service, but I hadn't decided whether it was going to be a Linux instance or a Windows instance. Another time, a lot of times performance goals, it might say needs clarification, or it might suggest, what the performance metrics should be for that. So it'll generate a file like this, and it'll have, various things, not just the, what your tech stack should be, but it'll also put in things to, put in various things that will be checked. So, Constitution check. So in order to pass off this, all the stuff has to be successful through the various testing. It might lay out the, project structure if you're in that particular phase of it. So in this particular case, it's actually, laid out what the structure of the application is going to be as far as the project structure. And as you make various decisions, it'll also document a lot of that stuff. So if it does ask you questions, it may provide additional details here as well, as far as that Q&A kind of stuff. So that's the technical plan. So as it's going through those first two steps, there are a number of other documents that might be generated. So for instance, one of the things for as part of the technical plan process, it'll create a quick start document most of the time. And what this does, is basically how to set up and run the application. Just like, you might write for another developer who is going to join the team. It generates these automatically. And it's, saying in this particular case, you check it out. You need to have a Blue Sky account, a Mastodon account. You need to, do your checkout, do a build. You need to set up your user secrets for the various things that are needed. For instance, in order to post to Blue Sky Mastodon, you need passwords and tokens and things like that. How to make calls to the API that gets written, that kind of stuff. So it'll document a bunch of this stuff as part of the quick start document. It'll also create sometimes a research document. And what this is if it needs to go out and get additional information about a particular process, it will create this research document of things that it went out. So if it went out and looked at, for instance, the Blue Sky documentation in order to figure out how to post to Blue Sky, it will document the information that it got from that and how it will be implemented as part of the project. So there's a bunch of information in this file about that kind of stuff. I showed you here a moment ago this requirements checklist. So I mentioned before that it may or may not create one or more checklist files. It may not create any. It just depends on what you're doing. And for each of those, it will create a bunch of them, and they'll all be blank to start with. But as it works through the various pieces, it'll check them off as completed. And until all of them have been checked off, it won't let you run the implementation step. It is smart enough most of the time to figure out, what things it has accomplished itself, so it'll check them off automatically. But sometimes you might need to come in and review and say, okay, that's actually done, and check it off yourself. So those are the things that might get generated. If you need data contracts, it'll generate a contracts file. Which includes things like the data model and the interactions for the data set. It may also create other research files. So it's got this main research one, but if there's specific research documents, for instance, this one is the one that generates specifically about the Blue Sky AT protocol. It'll create those under a research folder as well. So those are kind of the files that will get generated up to this point. The next part is the tasks file. So as it generates that, you can see here, it'll kind of define what the structure is and some of the notations that are in there. And it will create, it'll break it down into phases. So, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, whatever it might be. For each phase, there'll be one or more tasks. It'll define what the purpose of this phase is. It'll number the tasks 1 through whatever. And it'll, initially all of them will be blank and unchecked. And then as it, goes through and does the implementation piece, if it does it itself, it'll check these off itself. Or, if you as a developer complete one of the tasks, you would have to check that off manually. And for each, set of tasks, it might come up with a checkpoint and say, okay, after tasks 1, 2, and 3 are done, I have to have a successful .NET build. It has to build with 0 errors and 0 warnings. That kind of thing. So again, then it'll go on to phase 2. And until this checkpoint is successful, the implement command won't go on to the next step. So if something was failing on task 3, it won't go on to task 4. It will flag also tasks as ones that can be run in parallel. So it'll put this little P flag here that says, okay, I can do 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 all at the same time. So sometimes it'll spin off, if you let it, it'll spin off parallel processes and be able to, run those tasks simultaneously, because it knows that none of those tasks are dependent on each other. It's smart enough to figure out that kind of stuff as it's figuring out what the task list is. So it'll break that down to a number of different phases. Then after all the tasks are defined, then it'll put in some additional notes about dependencies and phase orders and what's dependent on what. If it gets a little more complex than what's up above. So for instance here, US2 depends on US1, US3 depends on US1. It'll define these kinds of things as it's going through these various tasks and just so it knows, in order to do these, I have to first do this other set of stuff. And it'll define that for each of the tasks as it needs to. Then down here, there's some stuff about, it'll come up with some strategy stuff. As it's implementing it, here's what you need to do as far as working through the various strategy pieces. Here's what you can do in parallel, and so on and so forth. And it'll add some additional notes down here at the bottom to describe some additional details that might be relevant to the various tasks that are going on. So that's the task step, and then this is the one that gets checked off as it's working through the various pieces of the the task list, or through the implementation phase. So another project that I've kind of been working on, which I've been using Spec-Kit almost entirely to do, is a application which I'm kind of creating to let people track, RPGs and to have a number of tools related to that, because I'm big into tabletop games and Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot. So I've created this website. This website has been entirely created using Spec-Kit and AI. I've done virtually no hand coding myself in this, and I'm doing this kind of as an experiment to see just what kind of thing I can create with a project like Spec-Kit. So you can see here, if I bring in the code version of this here, let me zoom that in a little bit. So you can see I've gone through 15 iterations so far. I'm kind of in the middle of this world map redesign because I didn't like how the world map piece was working. So, for each of these, it's created things like data models and contracts, and specified open API. So under the contracts, I've got an open API specification document here. But what has come out of that so far is this application here. And you can see I've got a bunch of tools here. So for instance, like an NPC generator. And, I can just do that randomly. I've got like an encounter generator here, can generate random encounters, so on and so forth. So let's see, it's like Dungeon Map. I don't think this works very well yet. Oh, I guess it kind of does. So like a simple dungeon map generator here. I kind of forget where some of these have been left off because some need to be worked on some more. Like a random town generator, that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of different tools here. And as I mentioned, this has been entirely created using AI and Spec-Kit. And I've done, like I said, I've not done a single thing coding wise. And it works pretty well. And I may someday actually post that out for the world to use. But for the moment, it's all just kind of internal playing around and seeing what I can accomplish using tools like AI and Spec-Kit. So that's kind of what I've got going there on that. I guess maybe pause here. Are there any questions up to this point? Anybody has? Before I kind of get into my last couple of slides. Oh, there's a bunch there. Let's see here. See, do I have an average token use? To be honest, I don't really track the tokens that I'm using. So I've got a GitHub Copilot Pro Plus subscription, and I've also got a Claude $20 a month subscription. The Claude subscription, I regularly run out of tokens. You get like 5-hour periods, and I do regularly run out of tokens for that. So I don't use that as much as I used to, and it seems to have gotten worse over the last couple of months. Copilot, so far, there's only been 1 month that I have actually run out of the tokens that I get as part of that. Although they have announced that they're completely redoing how Copilot works at the beginning of next month, or maybe it was the beginning of this month, I don't remember. So, we'll see how that goes as we kind of get into that. So yeah, token usage, and I don't spend a lot of time on this. I spend maybe, I would guess maybe 10 hours a week at most, because I'm only using this for my personal stuff and just playing around, like the occasional evening or weekend or whatever it might be. So I don't, I've got coworkers who literally are spending all their time doing AI development on their free time. And one guy that I know, he's got like those $200 a month Claude subscriptions, and he never runs out of tokens for that. But again, he does a lot more than I do. So, and as I mentioned, all these AI agents, the amount of usage that you're getting for the money that you're paying seems to be plummeting really fast. So, and it's only going to get worse, I think, as we get further into it. Question: does Spec-Kit increase context and token usage? Yes, it does. It's definitely using more token usage. That's why you kind of have to plan out. I guess I should say it depends on how you're approaching it. If you're planning it out well, if you're providing those details and laying out, for instance, your constitution file, if you're being very particular about how it gets laid out, then it actually might end up saving you tokens just because you're designing it well. And it's the same as it would be, if you're writing your agent markdown file, your Claude markdown file yourself. You have to be concise. You have to lay it out, plan it well. I guess it depends. I guess that's the answer to that. As far as whether it's better suited to certain size or complex developments, I haven't been doing it with anything except my own personal development so far. So I don't know how well it works on a massive project. This D&D project that I've been working on is the by far the biggest one that I've done with it so far. So you can see here, it's a fairly good sized project, and it's got quite a bit to it as far as endpoints and my data contracts and various things. So it's by far not a tiny proof of concept type project. So it seems to still work pretty well for that. I have noticed that in general, the bigger the project, the worse AI does with it. Because we have tried, in my day-to-day and my day job, we have tried messing around with using AI to assist in development for some of that stuff, and it seems to be, for like a massive enterprise grade project, it seems to struggle quite a bit with how well it does. But as long as you're restricting it fairly well and keeping your focus of what the AI is doing very small, it seems to do fine with that. See the next question. When I wanted to change the world map, did I modify the original spec? So no, I created an entirely new story here. So where is that at? Wrong one. Where is it? Here we go. So the original world map was done here in Spec 8. And then for Spec 15 is one where I said, okay, I want you to rip out the entire existing world map, and we're going to use this approach to doing it instead. And it's still in progress. I haven't gotten to the point where it's actually functional yet, because I've had to do a lot of bug fixing. So that's another thing with Spec-Kit. It lays things out pretty well, but like any AI coding agent, it doesn't always write the code completely successfully, and it has some struggles with that. So he says you feel like the Constitution was burning a lot of tokens for boilerplate checks, at least for me. So it can be, if and that's one of the whole problems with AI in general, is that whether it's a Constitution file or an agents file or Claude file or whatever it might be, these files that get included with every pass of the context, you have to kind of find that balance between what should be included in that, what should be the guiding principle, because you got to remember these AI agents don't have any memory. From one request to the next, it has completely forgotten what it did in the previous request. And these files, like the Constitution file, are there to be passed in with context, so that it has at least some memory tied to that as well, so that it's able to not have to rework through stuff or figure out again all that stuff, because that kind of thing will actually increase your context and your token usage quite a bit if it has to figure out certain details over and over and over again with every request. That's why we create these files that get included with every request, so it doesn't have to figure all that stuff out again. Let's see. So Lee, you got your hand raised there in the room. Is there a question from there?
Yeah, there's a question from a room, and while I'm going over to the person who's asked, I'm just going to have a follow-on to Greg's question, which is, does that mean that if you aren't modifying the existing specs, you would probably not check them into source control? Are they're not really, like if your original spec is now not the source of truth, the sort of combination of the first one and the last one is the source of truth, that means you can't just like regenerate your code from your specs, and you wouldn't necessarily check in your specs to source control. Is that true?
No, I think it's an important part of spec-driven development that the documents are always the source of truth, and that they're always living and should always be included as part of the source control. Just because things change doesn't mean that it's not still the source of truth. Yeah, there's a more up-to-date source of truth that you include in for instance, Spec 15. I've got a new source of truth essentially for my world map generator, but the original documentation is still there as part of the code, and it's still there as part of the documentation, and it's still still more or less the source of truth as it was at the time. But I think that's an important part of that, as opposed to whether the document's in DevOps or SharePoint or Jira or whatever it is, where you completely lose that context. Because if you've ever tried to go back to find documentation about a particular set of code that you did, or a particular user story that you did, and it's tied into DevOps or whatever it might be, how hard that is to try to find all that original documentation, because somehow you have to make your way back to that original document and figure out, okay, or the original user story, and go with it from there, and just figure out, okay, that's what it was at the time. Whereas if it's always there in the source or in the source code along with the project, you don't have to go anywhere else. It's right there. You just do a quick search or you can even just look at the specs and see which one is which.
Hang on. Go ahead.
Oh. Yeah, my question was around production, right? This is not in production, it's on your, dev box. But I see, on a large project where there's multiple developers, the source of truth could be multiple depending on, are you business analyst 1, business analyst 2, somebody else weighing in on things. So I answered my own question, but yeah, thank you.
Sort of
all right.
One more question.
So sort of tangential would be, what about laying this on top of an already existing medium to large project?
So I actually did do that. Don't know if I've got that handy at the moment. I did take a project that I had created and added Spec-Kit to it, and it actually did set it up pretty well. So what it happened is when I ran the init command, the specify init command, and then I ran the constitution command the first time, it basically went through. It recognized that it was in a folder that already had a project in it. It went through and examined the project, did an analysis of the project, and said, okay, based on how this project is written, these are your coding standards. These are the, here's the technical design. Here's the existing project structure. Here we see, I see that you're doing test-driven development. I see that you're using, .NET. I see that your front-end project is using these particular standards. It sees the test, whatever it might be. It can examine all that, and it can kind of backfill a constitution file based on the existing project structure, and it did a really good job of that. So it does work quite well. I mean, obviously you don't have that historical information of how it got to that point, but going forward from that point, it does a pretty good job of setting up that initial constitution and going from there.
I have another question. As these spec files get bigger, do you start using more and more tokens?
It doesn't really, because the documents So for instance, your constitution document won't change that much from the time it was initially created. And then the only documents that are getting included are those that are part of the current specification that you're working on. So, if I'm working on specification 15, it's not including any of the stuff from 1 to 14. So it's not like, with each specification, that context gets bigger and bigger and bigger. None of that stuff gets included. It's only concerned with what's in the current folder that it's working with.
Okay, but does it know about the stuff that was there before, or?
Yeah, it can still access that information if it needs to. And like I say, for instance, like the technical design stuff, you don't need to re-specify that in each iteration for the stuff that's there before. It can just figure out what it is from the project structure, and it can review those existing files if it needs to. But for the most part, I haven't noticed that the context grows at all over time as my project has gotten bigger and bigger.
Okay, I just have one last question.
Sure.
Have you used this with Angular? Just curious.
I have with trying to think of what project that was I was doing. Let me see if I've got that handy. No, I don't have that. Oh, yeah, there it is. No, I wasn't using Spec-Kit with that one. I was actually doing that with a different approach. So, I mean, the actual, the actual code that you're using really doesn't matter to Spec-Kit, because Spec-Kit is not doing the actual coding or design. All Spec-Kit is doing is guiding whichever AI agent that you're using in order to help that agent be more productive in what it does and more specific in the code that it creates. So it's more a matter of if I'm using Copilot or if I'm using Claude or if I'm using ChatGPT as my agent. That's what really matters. And all the Spec-Kit does is kind of guide that agent to do its job better. That's the goal. Let's see here, a couple more questions in the chat. Have I tried other spec frameworks? I haven't. So if I kind of jump back over here to the slides, there isn't a whole lot out there right now. There are a couple of, I'll come back to this in a second. So there are a couple of other frameworks that are out there. One is Amazon Kira and the other is Tesla framework. Those are the only other two that I know about right now that kind of follow the spec-driven design approach. And I have not used either of those, so I can't really speak to, contrast comparison between them. So as far as, I think there was one more question here. Do I find that scaffolding provided by Spec-Kit allows you to work successfully with less capable models? So I actually have found that for certain models, for instance, because for instance, Claude, you've got Sonnet and you've got whatever the really expensive one is. I can't remember off the top of my head. But you've got a couple of different models that Claude offers, and one of them does a lot better at coding than the other, but it's a lot more expensive to use. But I have found that Spec-Kit kind of makes Sonnet, which is kind of like the cheaper one, work a little bit better than otherwise. It kind of guides it a little bit better and helps it to be more successful. So, I mean, I guess, with all these AI models, they're constantly changing, and your mileage, may vary. So it comes back to the standard answer of it depends. So that's really what it is. So do I enjoy building things with Spec-Kit? I do. I think it's for these personal projects that I've been applying it to, I think it works really well and is very good. For instance, my dungeon host project here that I'm working on, it's something that I've wanted to do for years, but it's, if I were to code all this myself, I would still be working on it years later. And so I just never got the motivation to kind of dig down and do it. But with this, it's kind of reinvigorated my desire to work on some of these personal projects, just because I know that it's for me, made me a lot more productive in that kind of stuff. So I enjoy doing it that, yeah. As far as any trade-offs that I didn't like to make spec-driven development work for me, I don't know. I mean, I think that the trade-offs, I don't think there's anything Spec-Kit specific that I consider a trade-off. It's more the AI models themselves, which really aren't, are really tied to the models and not tied to Spec-Kit and how Spec-Kit does it. I think whatever model I'm using, Spec-Kit has made it more productive and more successful. But there are issues with a lot of the models. For instance, I haven't found any model that does a good job with Blazor development. They all seem to suck equally. Same thing with like Entity Framework. Although the newest versions of Claude and ChatGPT both seem to do much better with Entity Framework than the previous version. So there is hope, I guess. But of course, the trade-off is they're a lot more expensive than they used to be. So yeah, you get both ways there. So just kind of one last slide that I wanted to go through real fast here. As far as best practices, the biggest thing is to keep your iterations small, and make sure that you're keeping an eye on what the AI is doing. And it still needs guidance. It's AI. It'll go off the rails if you let it. So you need to make sure that you're working with it. You're keeping things small and you're keeping them focused on specific small tasks. Iterate. Keep it small and iterate. That's kind of repeating all the same again. So iterate. There are a bunch of resources out there. The biggest thing is the Spec-Kit website. It's got some information there. The documentation on the website is a little out of date, so sometimes it doesn't actually work quite right the way that it lays out there. But for the most part, it seems to be pretty good there. So, all right. Is there any other last questions? Anybody else?
Yeah. Can you please put the references slide up again?
Yep.
Just one question, and then Das here.
Hello, thank you so much for the presentation. For the existing application, I think you already addressed that the code that is already there, the Spec-Kit can look into that and generate the results, right? What are the outcomes or whatever. So if the requirements and the technical documents are in, for example, in my Atlassian tools like Confluence or in my Jira or in Word document and all, can Spec-Kit integrate with that? And can I say that sync with this Spec-Kit and then on top of it so that I can add the functionalities?
There's not really anything out of the box to kind of sync with like an existing set of documentation. There are in the community extensions here. There are extensions that people have added for Azure DevOps and Jira and a couple of the other documentation things. I haven't played around with any of them, so I don't know if there's a way to make use of those to kind of give it a starting point as far as existing documentation goes. So I don't know for certain one way or the other. I have not made any attempts to do so I can't really speak to that one way or the other. I mean, you can obviously, download the documents and put them in as references into the repo and put in a reference to into your constitution file, which says, okay, I've got this folder here with existing documentation that you can go look at as a starting point. And I have done that kind of thing before, and it does, but not specifically with Spec-Kit. I've done that with other AI agents, and they're able to reference that documentation that I've included in there, or else provide them a link to it. So I would imagine it would probably work the same way with Spec-Kit. I just haven't tried it.
We got one more question from Cliff here.
Thank you. Great presentation. You started off by saying that AI is not capable of building commercial applications, yet your Dungeons and Dragons thing, you make it sound like you're going to make it commercial. And really my question is trying to identify where that problem is. I think AI could build a hello world app, commercial grade. I think it could build a to-do app, maybe a new a north wind type thing, but it probably can't build Salesforce CRM. I understand, but
Yeah.
where along the line is, I guess maybe it's your definition of commercial grade, but where along the line is it not able to handle what you think is required for a commercial app?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's another one of those it depends kind of things. For instance, I with one of my previous clients worked on a project that had it was a .NET solution that had like 28 projects in it, and and every one of those projects had hundreds of files in it. So it's really, I think, a matter of scale, because there is a limit to the context that an AI agent can access at any particular time. So it's one of those things where it can only look at a little piece. It can't see the whole scope of everything all at once. So as that improves, and it has improved vastly over the last 6 to 8 months, especially across a number of the AI agents, and I think eventually it might get there to the point where it can figure out ways to look at these massive applications and kind of distill down to a summary version so that it can understand the massive scope of everything. AI is great, I think, at focusing on small pieces and small sections, but it doesn't really do well with massive scale and scope and overall architecture kind of things, at least so far. So like I say, it keeps getting better, and we'll see 6 months from now, 12 months from now, it might be a completely different ball game. Although I think 6 to 12 months from now, none of us are going to be able to afford AI, so we'll see how it goes.
No other questions in the room.
All right.
Any other questions online?
I don't think there's anything in the chat that I didn't see.
Might have a question from Adine. You come off mute.
Maybe Adine has one there. Yeah.
I can't type fast enough, but so
No
let me
worries.
just so based on that, if it does, I do see that it's gotten more expensive, and they are changing the plans, and it's like everything has boomed in 2026. So I see what you're talking about. But being from your perspective, if it becomes that far out of reach, then what is do you see it because I do not see, I'm like you, I don't see it just totally out of the gate. You have to iterate, you have to refactor. I mean, I don't see it just, it just produces something that I can just go with. I have not been able to prompt it or use it in such a way that it just produces something that I'm never like, oh, tweak this, or, oh, this doesn't comply, So with that, do you see that the developers, like what, with your comment about it becoming out of reach and not affordable, then what does that mean for developers? Or like, what are you seeing from your perspective?
Well,
different vision or different level.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects, and I don't know that anybody can predict it perfectly. And we are already seeing some kind of kickback on things. I think it was maybe a month ago, IBM announced that they were going to invest in a bunch of entry-level developers, adding them just because they were seeing that the benefits of AI weren't as much as they had hoped initially. And a lot of companies, I think, are starting to see that the amount of money that they're investing in their AI expenditures is starting to outpace what they were spending on the developers that they let go in order to add AI.
Okay.
So there is some kind of shift back and forth. I think it'll continue to go back and forth, especially as AI gets more expensive, as we're seeing over especially the last couple of months, where several of these AI vendors have both raised their prices as well as reduced the amount of access that you get for the price that you're paying. And with the latest one being Copilot, with what they announced a few days ago. So I think that trend will continue. My boss, R. Dallas, had posted on his personal blog. I don't have a link handy here, but he did a pretty good article a couple of weeks ago about where we're at as far as the costs of AI and the direction that he sees it going, and where at least short term he sees the future going as far as that goes. So I think, honestly, I think it's just going to keep going back and forth, because these vendors will get more expensive, but over time these AI models will get more efficient and more productive and more successful. And as it kind of keeps going back and forth, I think it'll just kind of keep facilitating back and forth. And that's my personal opinion. I don't know that anybody's going to be able to predict it. So
Yeah. Thank you. No, that helps. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well, if anybody has any questions in the future, you can get a hold of me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. Those are the best ways to reach me there.